Deep physical and mental fatigue, anxiety, insomnia, depression, headaches, heart palpitations, and menstrual irregularity. These are all symptoms of neurasthenia. Before the late 19th century, a person's mental state was seen as only one of two ways: normal or psychotic. But the turn of the century disorder neurasthenia was considered the compromise that lied between. The majority of those diagnosed were women. The late 19th century and early 20th century physicians generally agreed that the cause for this psychological epidemic was a result of women's increased participation in society. As influenced by social Darwinism, it was widely believed that upper-class women were especially susceptible to the disorder.
Physicians of the time actually believed that the upper class were the most highly evolved humans, thus possessing more sensitive nervous systems than others. Moreover, since it was believed that women had more delicate nervous systems than men, it made sense to conclude that they were particularly prone to severe exhaustion after nervous shocks.
Taking to bed and becoming an invalid for an indefinite period of time was a culturally accepted response to being diagnosed with neurasthenia. And as physicians generally supported traditional views of gender roles, they typically prescribed increased doses of passivity and domesticity as the treatment. They warned their patients that too much mental or physical exertion would lead to nervous collapse. It was therefore self-destructive for a woman to seek fulfillment in the competitive workplace or through intellectual endeavors. Lois Burnett Rantoul's case of neurasthenia is particularly interesting. Lois was the granddaughter of the great poet and abolitionist James Russell Lowell, so when she sought divorce from husband Edward Rantoul in 1912, all of Boston took interest. The public was granted all access into her personal life, and newspapers eventually revealed that she had actually been subjected to severe psychological abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse from her husband.
Well, whether the diagnosis of neurasthenia was a direct result of the abuse or not is undetermined. But this information did direct focus to Edward Rantoul's behavior within the marriage. Friends and physicians testified that Edward would forbid Lois to read books or participate in charity work. Her husband eventually admitted on the stand that he hadn't read a book in 10 years. It was clear that he felt inferior to his wife's intellectual capacity.
Once Lois Burnett Rantoul was liberated from her restrictive and abusive marriage, she began to pursue her interests in social activism. The memory of her grandfather, James Russell Lowell, greatly influenced Rantoul's break from the dull and narrow-minded world of her banker husband and turned her toward progressive political activism. Shortly after the divorce trial ended, Lois joined the Boston Women's Trade Union League, established in 1903 to organize women workers and to promote protective labor legislation. Her commitment to the WTUL represented a complete elimination of her husband's values and her neurasthenia treatments. Her efforts later included participating in the defense of Italian anarchist Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, and involvement in the movement for prison reform. Lois Burnett Rantoul's neurasthenia seemed to have essentially dissolved after the liberation of her abusive marriage and after the development of her activism with women workers and prisoners. Therefore, it seems Rantoul's intellectual endeavors were actually the cure and not the cause. Jane Addams, undoubtedly the most prominent figure in the progressive era, also suffered from neurasthenia. But she not only rejected the restrictive treatments, she advised against it. Through speeches and through her best-selling account of the settlement house movement, Addams urged the growing ranks of young college women to avoid neurasthenia by dedicating themselves to helping the urban poor. Social work, she argued, would allow them to escape the neurasthenia-inducing doldrums awaiting those who followed Victorian expectations and sequestered themselves within the home. In a similar fashion, Charlotte Perkins Gilman worked to contradict both the cure and the treatments for neurasthenia. In her most famous written piece, The Yellow Wallpaper, A story is told of a woman who suffers from mental illness after 3 months of being closeted in a room by her husband for the sake of her health. She becomes obsessed with the room's revolting yellow wallpaper.
Gilman wrote this story to change people's minds about the role of women in society, illustrating how women's lack of autonomy is detrimental to their mental, emotional, and even physical well-being. The narrator in the story must do as her husband, who is also her doctor, demands, although the treatment he prescribes contrasts directly with what she truly needs. Mental stimulation, the freedom to escape, the monotony of the room to which she is confined, that's what she really needs. The yellow wallpaper was essentially a response to the doctor who had tried to cure Gilman of her depression through a rest cure, which included prescriptions of isolation, submission to her husband, and the elimination of intellectual endeavors.
Dr. S. Ware Mitchell, the physician who treated Gilman and created the rest cure, was eventually sent a copy of the story. By the 1930s, fewer and fewer physicians were diagnosing neurasthenia. Neurasthenia's heavy reliance on cultural explanations began to evolve out of the picture as urbanization, the growth of office work, and women's increased participation in society became more commonplace and were less frequently thought of as unhealthy.